These are the children of St. Helena on their annual march through the streets of Jamestown in this tiny South Atlantic island. St. Helena is universally known for its associations with the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. But this little island, one of Britain's oldest colonies, has a history which stretches back over 4 centuries. The island was formed by volcanic action in primeval times. A dot in the South Atlantic, only 10 miles long by 6 wide, it lies more than 1,000 miles from Africa and nearly 2,000 miles from South America. It is believed to be the oldest land mass in the world, but it was entirely unknown until 1502, when Portuguese mariners returning from a voyage to India first sighted its steep cliffs. It was the feast day of St. Helen, and they named the island in her honor. They found it uninhabited except for birds, seabirds, and a solitary land bird, a type of plover, which, having no enemies, scurries along the ground more often than it flies. St. Helena's wire bird, so called for its long, thin legs, exists nowhere else in the world. The Portuguese found fresh water and lush vegetation, and they kept their discovery a secret for 86 years. The first settler, and the first of many exiles, was a Portuguese Robinson Crusoe. Tortured and disgraced for treason in India, he chose to live here for over 30 years. In the path of the trade winds, St. Helena became a haven for ships on the India route. The voyager Thomas Cavendish chanced upon it in 1588, and soon English and later Dutch ships too began to call. When the Dutch claimed the Cape of Good Hope, the English East India Company occupied St. Helena, and since 1659, the island has been a British possession. In the days when European powers vied for the East India trade, St. Helena became an island fortress, and her defenses were intensified during Napoleon's exile. Most of the vantage points are honeycombed with crumbling batteries and rusting cannon, hauled up the cliffs by block and tackle. But Britain's ownership went unchallenged, and a shot was never fired in anger. For nearly 200 years, the East India Company held the island, which prospered from the presence of soldiers of the garrison and sailors from passing ships. Over 1,000 ships a year used to drop anchor in the safe roadstead of James Bay, safe except when the great rollers came up, sometimes to dash sailing ships to pieces. Today, only a few ships call, for with the advent of steam and the opening of the Suez Canal, the island's importance declined. Vessels anchor off Jamestown, which lies at the bottom of a narrow valley between towering cliffs. Jamestown, the only town, is separated from the seafront by a moat and is entered through a gateway in the castle wall, leading onto an open square. The castle is the headquarters of the government of St. Helena and her dependencies, far-flung Tristan da Cunha and Ascension. Also facing onto the square is St. James's Church, the oldest in the island, which stands on the site where the Portuguese discoverers once built their chapel. There is an air of old-world charm. Jamestown is unique. Here, in the middle of a vast ocean, is a Georgian village in a tropical setting. Hardly more than 1 street wide, slow and unhurried. The building with the veranda is the Consulate Hotel, the only one in the island. In this building, known as the Canister, is the handicraft shop where the exquisite island lace is sold. Here, too, are displayed relics of the past, an old iron sea chest, perhaps left behind by some 17th century buccaneer, the bell from a wrecked ship, and a reminder that Halley and Maskelyne both came here to study the southern skies, an astronomical instrument. Among the many famous men who visited St. Helena are Captain Cook, Captain Bligh of the Bounty, and Charles Darwin. Royal visits are recorded by patriotic slogans. The streets have quaint names, some of them recalling incidents in the colony's history. Chinese laborers and artisans were brought here in 1800, and some island faces reflect Chinese ancestry. Indian castaways from the Maldive Islands made the gardens of early 18th century Maldivia House, the settlement's first hospital. Here, the Zulu chief Dinizulu stayed for part of his 7 years' exile during the 1890s. But the most famous exile of all arrived in October 1815. He was Napoleon Bonaparte, destined to spend the last 6 years of his life in St. Helena. At first, he stayed at the Briars, where he must often have gazed at the lovely heart-shaped waterfall nearby. Elegant Briars Pavilion, presented to France in 1959, is now a small museum of Napoleonic relics. After 7 weeks, the prisoner was moved to Longwood, his last home. This house, on a high windswept plateau in a tiny South Atlantic island, became the center of world attention. Longwood House has been French territory since 1858. The famous captive caused his garden paths to be sunk into the lawn to shield him from the gaze of ever-present sentries. There is a lily pond which bears a curious resemblance to Napoleon's hat. The tiny summer house afforded him privacy, and cut into the shutters of Longwood House are spyglass holes placed to suit the little corporal's height, enabling him to see without being seen. From the house of his companions, Count and Countess Bertrand, he would watch troop movements and horse races on Deadwood Plain. Ill health, quarreling among his retinue, and restrictions imposed by the zealous governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, made his exile hard to bear. He was, however, able to go for rides in the country, and at Mount Pleasant, an estate high in the hills, he was once entertained to a champagne breakfast on the lawns. He didn't see Mount Pleasant again, for 7 months later, in May 1821, the man who had conquered Europe lay dying. His simple grave bore no inscription. In 1840, his remains were taken back to France, amidst great ceremony, aboard the French frigate La Belle Poule. In charge of the expedition was the Prince of Joinville, son of King Louis-Philippe of France. Today, the tricolour flies over the empty grave. The lovely valley of the tomb is also a domain of France. Napoleon's brooding spirit seems to hang over this sad, silent place. Jamestown comes to life on Saturdays, for Saturday is market day, and a big day for the shops and for the country people who've been wending their way through the hills since long before dawn, their donkeys laden with produce for the market. Donkeys provide essential transport in this mountainous island, where many places can only be reached on foot. Until 1929, motor cars were not allowed, and the island's first car, a baby Austin, is still in use. In spite of an ideal climate, fruit is difficult to grow, although there are bananas, mangoes, and other tropical fruits, and delicious little island plums. Business over, the donkeys are loaded up, and it's time to start for home, back into the hills and valleys of the interior. Out of Jamestown's deep ravine lead 2 narrow switchback roads, Side Path and Ladder Hill Road. Carved into the cliffside, both are single width and a supreme test for backseat drivers. But accidents are almost unknown on St. Helena's 75 miles of winding, twisting roads, which call for low speeds and courteous driving. Ladder Hill takes its name from the famous Jacob's Ladder, built by the Royal Engineers in 1828 as a direct, if rather alarming, link between the fort on the cliffs and the town below. 699 almost vertical steps and the longest staircase in the world. Islanders tackle the heartbreaking climb slowly. They use a curious swinging gait and heave themselves up by the handrails. Going down can be much quicker for those who are prepared to risk the world's longest banister slide. A footpath leads out of town to Munden's Fort, where for 3 years St. Helena's most recent exiles were housed. They were 3 political prisoners from the Sheikhdom of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, who were released in 1960. Beyond lies desolate Rupert's Valley, a sad place haunted by the ghosts of slaves and lepers. During the South African War, 6,000 Boer prisoners were held captive in St. Helena, and a condensing plant, now abandoned, supplied them with fresh water. At Rupert's Bay, the submarine cable comes ashore. St. Helena's linked with the outside world. Through this important cable station flows the world's communication. London and Cape Town are seconds apart. Like a continent in miniature, there is astonishing variety in St. Helena's 47 square miles. The bare volcanic clinker gives way to cactus-covered slopes, until at an altitude of 1,500 feet, with startling contrast, the luxuriant uplands are reached. Suddenly the scene becomes one of spectacular beauty, with wooded hillsides, green pastures, and trickling streams. Many views remind the visitor of England, like Hutt's Gate Store, once an inn frequented by Napoleon's guards. However, a glance at the map shows that only a third of the island is green. Soft rain falls over the interior highlands, for the southeast trade winds bring the mists that constantly swirl round the highest slopes. To the south lies the district of Sandy Bay, part of a huge sunken crater. Rising out of the ancient crater are the weird volcanic pillars known as Lot and Lot's Wife. A dense tangle of indigenous vegetation clothes the highest peaks, Acton and Diana, which soar nearly 3,000 feet above the sea. In spite of this pastoral setting, agriculture presents a problem, since there is so little arable land. Meat is scarce, and most foodstuffs have to be imported. But the government is doing its best to improve and increase the stock, so that the colony may become more self-sufficient. St. Helena produces excellent coffee, but not in sufficient quantities for export. Erosion has been aggravated by the onslaughts of hundreds of goats, descendants of a few brought by the Portuguese. Throughout the years, these greedy animals have eaten most of the shore vegetation. But today, their numbers have been drastically reduced, and all survivors must be tethered. The island's main industry is the cultivation and processing of New Zealand flax, which yields a fiber suitable for rope making. The flax, which grows best on the highest ground, is cut and tied into bundles, ready to be sent down to the mill in various ways. From the steepest slopes, an overhead cable is used. In the more accessible parts, it is loaded into lorries. The usual method of transporting the flax bundles is on the backs of nimble pack donkeys. They know their own way down the mountain tracks to the mills in the valleys far below. Machines remove the green pulp, and the stripped fibre is then washed to remove acid. The dripping hanks of fibre are now loaded onto lumbering bullock carts and hauled through winding lanes to the drying fields. With characteristic motions, the workers spread the skeins of wet hemp to dry, where it forms a golden patchwork on the green hillsides. When dry, the fibre is collected. Dust and tow will be removed before it is baled for export, mainly to Britain and South Africa. The flax industry was successfully established early in this century to bolster the island's economy, which was dealt a severe blow by the removal of the entire military garrison. A certain amount of rope and twine is made in the island for export and for local needs. It is an interesting fact that the British General Post Office uses St. Helena twine. Strands are dyed green to identify rope used in government departments. The making of rope is one of man's oldest crafts, and St. Helena's rope walk differs only from those of ancient times in having a winding engine. A termite-ridden tree trunk reveals the curse of St. Helena, the white ant. Woodwork is turned to dust by the invisible enemy, and some buildings are mere shells. It was a sad day for the island when the infested timbers of a slave ship were used on shore. Constant repairs are necessary, and only a few imported hardwoods are immune. Fortunately, many gracious 18th century houses have survived, such as charming Rose Cottage and Plantation House, the home of St. Helena's governors since 1791. In the garden of Plantation House lives the oldest inhabitant, Jonathan, a giant tortoise who may be as much as 150 years old. But he never met Napoleon, who died long before Jonathan was brought from the far-off Indian Ocean. St. Helena's only reptiles are lizards. There are no snakes. This little tortoise was brought from Cape Town by Sam Quinn, the cobbler, who served for many years in the Royal Navy. Like Sam, many islanders leave to seek their fortunes abroad, but someday they usually return to their peaceful home. In Cambrian House lives the grand old lady of St. Helena, Miss Pritchard, whose ancestors came here in 1666 after the Great Fire of London. The colony's 4,500 inhabitants speak only English and lead a typically English way of life. Their proficiency as marksmen is possibly a relic of garrison days. They frequently carried off the honors in the colonial small bore competition. Young St. Helenians enjoy simple pleasures. These children have never seen a train, an aeroplane, a city street, tall buildings. But at school they learn about the wonders of the outside world. One day many of them will leave to find work in England, and there are jobs for the young men at the American Missile Tracking Base 700 miles away in Ascension Island. There are 12 schools in all, and from this one, at the top of the ladder, it's a quick trip home to Jamestown. The teenagers keep up with the times, thanks to the radio and the local cinema. The girls hurry to change into their guide uniforms, while down in the town there is great excitement as the Scouts and Cubs prepare to leave for their annual camp at Thompson's Wood in the remote western end of the island. Tradition lingers on in St. Helena. The colourful signs of the friendly benefit societies catch the eye. These societies protect the islander in times of sickness and unemployment. Members of the Working Men's Christian Association gather for their annual parade while the band warms up. Dressed in their regalia, the men form up for the ceremonial slow march through the streets of Jamestown, ending in a church service. St. Helenians are religious people. The majority are Anglicans, but most Christian denominations are represented, and there are 13 churches in all. This is the Cathedral of St. Paul. In Jamestown there is a Catholic church, and in the churchyard of St. James, old tombstones tell of the island's role as a welcome place of call in the days of long, hard sailing voyages. Edward Watson, Esquire, judge of the Calcutta Court, expired on this island to which he had come for his health. Major General Hare, late Lieutenant Governor of the Cape of Good Hope, who died at sea. In another churchyard are the graves of the Boer prisoners of war who died in exile. Near Longwood is St. Matthew's, where the Church Lads Brigade is parading today. Far away, under the shadow of Lot, is a Baptist chapel. The congregation have climbed steep mountain paths from their cottages hundreds of feet below. The chapel can be reached only on foot, and the minister has had a long walk too. The Salvation Army meets for an outdoor service in the awe-inspiring setting of Sandy Bay. Only from a boat can the forbidding nature of the coast be seen. Jagged cliffs, no beaches, and very few landing places. The landmarks have attractive names: Speary Island, Wild Ram Hill, Horse Pasture Point, Egg Island, home of thousands of seabirds. These deep waters are a happy hunting ground for big game fishermen who come from South Africa to enjoy the sport. There are sailfish, barracuda, marlin, sharks, of course, and countless smaller varieties, some found nowhere else. But the main catch is tunny. A mackerel attached to a pole is dragged back and forth on the surface to attract the big fish, a local custom known as teasing. The tunny usually fall for this simple ruse. They never seem to learn. How pleasant at the end of a hard day's sport to return to the peaceful harbour. The fish are attached to a line and dropped overboard to be hauled ashore by willing hands and hung up for weighing. Today's catch includes a 250-pounder caught by a boatman on a hand line. Fortunately, sharks don't venture inshore, so it's quite safe to cool off in the deep tropical waters round the wharf. But the day's fishing isn't over for everyone. At sundown, the islanders row out to set the lobster pots. A ship has arrived, filling James Bay with her importance. As the anchor drops, the flag is run up on Ladder Hill. The official launch chugs away from the little port, which has become a hive of activity as the bales of flax are loaded into lighters. A fleet of longboats waits to ferry passengers ashore. As soon as the government officials have boarded the ship, together with the stevedores who've abandoned their normal jobs just for ship day. Among the passengers are returning St-Helenians, coming home on holiday, or perhaps to settle down after years of working abroad. Jumping from bobbing boat to slippery steps is a hazard for the visitors. But if Napoleon managed it, so can Aunt Flo. Most of the island's cars are pressed into service to drive the visitors to Longwood and the Emperor's Tomb, with a brief tour of the interior. In the town, there's a brisk trade in stamps and souvenirs, and the tourists have tea in the house once occupied by the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon's great adversary. Back on the ship, the serious business of offloading the vital supplies is in full swing. Also, the loading of the colony's equally vital export. It's a hectic few hours, for the vessel must sail on time to maintain her schedule. When it's all over, the lonely community will settle back into its quiet, leisurely ways, to wait with infinite patience the arrival of another ship. Ships were once grateful for St. Helena. Today, St. Helena is grateful for a ship.